Well, there's a lot happening right now in the country. One of the big things being talked about in the political sphere is the Supreme Court reform effort being undertaken by President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. What do you make of this? What do you think is driving it?
Well, look, I think it's no secret that this has long been used as a political tool to drive wedge issues between voters. And for some reason, a lame duck or a now lame duck President Joe Biden seems to think this is the way to go out of his presidency and set the next nominee or supposed nominee, Kamala Harris, up for success going into November. But that the Supreme Court would be used by the left as a political tool or a political weapon, I think is just simply shameful. Our Republican democracy here requires judicial independence. And for this administration, for now 4 years, to use this threat of court packing or some variant thereof to try to get their way, and then to sort of kick and scream when they don't get their way at the Supreme Court and decide to change the rules, it is overtly partisan. It is obviously partisan, and they should not be rewarded for their bad behavior.
When it comes to term limits with the Supreme Court, I find it interesting when you look at the Supreme Court's own website. On average, a Supreme Court justice serves for about 16 years. And, on average, some of the things that Biden is saying he wants to see happen and have codified are things that actually happen naturally in some ways. But okay, he wants these term limits. How would putting term limits in place, if this were something that he could get through, and we'll talk about how likely that is in a moment, but how would that change the court in your view, and how the court is not only operating, but maybe seen by the public?
Well, the immediate impact would be felt by Justices Thomas and Alito. And so are we at all surprised? Now it all comes clear into view what the real target here is. They can't get their way at the Supreme Court. And so now, in their view, they have to punish, as Senator Schumer warned, this is the whirlwind that those justices were beginning to reap by actually, reading the Constitution and going forward. But look, the hubris here that's involved, that somehow this administration knows better in the 250 plus year history of the United States than the founding fathers did on how to set up a tripartite form of government like we have, I think is just simply shocking and should shock the conscience of every American. What this would do immediately would be to drive off the two conservatives on the bench that the left hates the most. And that's, after all, the very point. This type of political vindictiveness should never be rewarded. It should be opposed vociferously by everybody we can possibly oppose it. Most of all, Congress, but especially those who propose such ideas have no business running for the presidency again whatsoever.
One of the questions that is often not asked when these sorts of things happen, right? Because they're obviously, the target here is a lifetime appointment. The Supreme Court, when you're nominated to the Supreme Court and you're confirmed, you stay there until you die or you choose to leave. And I don't think this has ever happened, or you're kicked out. And that takes quite an act of God almost to make that happen. That's never really happened. So you have to willingly leave or die, essentially. Why did the founders set it up this way? Because that's a question, again, people are not asking. Why is this the system we have in place right now?
Because it affords the maximal amount of judicial independence. It insulates the court from any of the political machinations of the day. And we only need to look a few feet away to see how important that is, given the last couple of weeks and the turmoil that we've faced. I mean, goodness gracious, on our political environment that we face right now, our October surprise this year may just be an alien invasion, for Pete's sake. It's been a crazy political season, but that does not need to impact the Supreme Court of the United States. We've given them lifetime tenure so that we are not driving the decisions of the Supreme Court based upon the whims of a fanciful American public and the votes that they make. But President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris, and others are making this a political fight. They are trying to remove the last safeguards of our civil liberties, the Supreme Court of the United States, our independent judiciary, and turn it into another political football. Look, if we turn the Supreme Court back into a political entity now, that the administration gets to appoint so many people and they get to serve for so many lengths of time according to Congress, or if the separate but equal branches fail to operate separately or equally and exert more authority than is due them under the Constitution over the judiciary, then our civil rights, these precious rights of religious freedom and speech and all the other ones found in our Bill of Rights, all of those now become subject to the whims of a Democratic horde. And if we want to know what that looks like, I just turn you to the images that we've seen too many times now of stones being thrown, of windows being broken, of spray painting going on the sides of our monuments, all the different things you've seen, flags being burned. Those are the mobs that would be controlling the future of our Supreme Court. And the founding fathers knew that was in the heart of man. That's why they have insulated our judges from those types of political attacks and motivations, and given them the lifetime tenure, the space that they need to make difficult decisions that uphold our civil rights. President Biden, Kamala Harris, they are now actively trying to undermine that very judicial independence. And I think we have to hope and frankly pray that their efforts are unsuccessful.
One of the other things in ethics code that Biden wants to see with the justices and that they'd be bound by, of course, all of these things are very hard things to pass and make happen. When you're talking about a constitutional amendment, that's almost impossible, especially in this environment, to make happen. But when it comes to the ethics code, what do you make of that? Why do you think he's pushing for it? And what's your take on that?
Well, I find it interesting that the branch of government that polls the highest in terms of ethics and responsibility is being asked to develop an ethics code. I mean, maybe we should start talking to Congress, the Senate, and the presidency about their own ethics codes here, for goodness sakes. But look, there's plenty of ways to deal with that. In fact, the justices themselves have all recommitted to their own self-policing, a system that, by the way, has worked for 2 centuries in this country without significant problems. And even as recently as this last month, the justices have reaffirmed their commitment to those very good principles that they've had in place. And so I think what we're seeing from the president, from the incoming nominee for the Democratic Party also, is just more smoke screens available to say, look, they're using the terms that appeal to the base of Americans and seem to assert justice and fairness and all these things. But in reality, much of that is already in place. It's really just a smokescreen for what they want to sneak in the back door, which is complete judicial reform. They tried this back in 1937, and to quote then Senator Joe Biden, that was a bonehead idea. Well, it was a bonehead idea back then in 1937, and the Federal Judiciary Reorganization Act, the Senate rejected almost unanimously. Well, it's still a bonehead idea. The Senate back then, rejecting that motion by President Roosevelt, said that they hoped they would oppose it so much so that generations would never even think to undermine the judiciary ever again. And now here we are. What President Biden, then Senator Biden, called a bonehead idea, now he takes as part of his legacy in the lame duck portion of his presidency.
I want to come back to the previous discussion we were just having. If they were to get their way here and you would have people on the court, justices on the court serving 18 years, essentially you'd have a staggered system where every 2 years, essentially, a president is nominating somebody to the court. Would it be a scenario in your mind? I mean, look, we're talking about the court being too political and all these things that are being claimed, but now you're taking a president and the whole public is going to know, oh, that person gets 2 nominees. You're going to want to know who those nominees are. It almost becomes like, hey, now we're electing a president, vice president, and 2 Supreme Court justices, essentially, right? I mean, it would seem that it would make the political problem potentially worse.
Oh, it'd make it far worse. And we'll need to look back in the last administration and the great controversies that stemmed, unnecessary trumpeted controversies that came out with Justices Barrett and Kavanaugh. Do we want to have that circus every 2 years? I mean, goodness gracious, our political system right now is crazy enough. We don't need to add those monkeys into the circus, as it were. We need to maintain the status quo that we've had for 200 plus years that has worked just fine for these many years. And let's remember what I said before, the immediate impact would be with these term limits would be to basically show Justices Alito and Thomas the door, something that the left is salivating for right now. They want blood from these people. They want them off of the bench. They want to get them gone from those positions. And so they're trying to run a seemingly effective campaign that would mollify many critics of the court. But the end result would be the same. The justices that are doing the most damage to stem the tide of the leftist assault upon our civil liberties would be gone. And guess who would be put in their place? Well, more justices in the mold of Ketanji Brown Jackson and Sotomayor and others, the far left parts of the court. They would flip the decision-making body entirely. And so don't be fooled by these seemingly reasonable ideas or politically reasonable ideas raised by the presidency. The goal is the same thing, to pack the court, if not by number, then certainly by ideology. And that's exactly what the left is trying to do.
Final question, this landmark immunity ruling, as it's been referred to, and the idea that there'd be a constitutional amendment push to reverse what the Supreme Court found on immunity when it comes to former presidents. What is your take on this? What are they trying to do here? And obviously getting a constitutional amendment passed again, very unlikely, but what's your take on this?
Just one more political activity that against an institution that doesn't deserve the politics that is being given. Look, I think we've got to remember where we are right now. We are, about 100 days away from an election in this country. This could have been presented at any point in the Biden presidency. We are now just a few days away, a few months away from electing another president, a new president or a renewed president, one of the two, that will come into office in January. Why has the Biden administration decided this is the right time? Well, I think there's only one answer to that. They believe this helps them politically. And if it doesn't help them politically, then President Biden wants to be known as the judge who reorganized the federal judiciary and ensconced his legacy on the Supreme Court of the United States by removing 2 justices or more that he thinks need to go away because he doesn't agree with them. That is ludicrous, and every American watching should know the bald assertions that they're making here are political efforts to satisfy the very far left of his party on the way out the door.
Well, Jeremy, as always, appreciate your take, helping break down all these complex things for us. Thanks for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Billy.